named Jochebed. Right? She's a woman who her name is only mentioned twice that I can find in the Old Testament, and both are just in genealogies. It doesn't call her out by name in the story of Moses, but nevertheless, if not for her faith and her bravery, we never have the leader who God selects to lead Israel out of Egyptian captivity. Um, I think it's so important to me. Like, the Bible, hopefully most of you guys know, right? It's dominated by these stories of men, right? It's the words of men. It's, this male leader did this, but you also see that God very carefully lays out throughout Scripture the roles of women that are critical to the furthering of his plan, right? Off the top of my head, right, real quick in the Old Testament, right? You have Jochebed, right? We all that were here last quarter know the stories of Ruth, the stories of Esther. We know about Rahab, right? And we can probably think of countless others who they don't get a lot of screen time, so to speak, but the role they play in that limited amount that they are shown is so significant for God's story. But we don't just see Jochebed being brave, right? We also see the diligence of his sister, right? Miriam. She's just walking along with him, making sure. I'm certain they laid out this plan, right? The goal was always for Moses to end up being seen by someone and saved. It was not just chance. They throw him in the Nile and hope, right? There's always a plan. At least you hope there would be. But she shows up, and of course, she executes the plan to perfection. She suggests that Jochebed nurse the child. So Moses ends up, I think we don't know how long exactly. It just says kind of until he was weaned. But we can kind of guess, right, at what influence Jochebed had on him. Because when Moses gets to adulthood, even though he was raised an Egyptian, he very much knows his Hebrew Israelite heritage, right? So, these roles of women are very important here, and I think for us today, right, what this shows us is that like every single person has a role and every single person is important. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. I'd probably guess that Jochebed, when she was trying to save Moses, had no clue of what God's bigger plan was for Moses. All she knew was that she had a baby son who she wanted to protect from Pharaoh and did whatever she could to do that, right? Which is, a very natural thing, but yet plays this huge role in history. All right, so we're going to jump ahead here quite a bit, just to kind of focus on this battle of God versus Pharaoh. We'll get to Moses as a person here a little bit later. All right, so one of the big stories we hear in childhood Bible class, right, is God versus Pharaoh and the 10 plagues. Right, we might try to memorize them. We talk through them. There's visuals on walls in children's classrooms sometimes of the 10 plagues. But what were they really showing us? So the importance of the plagues is that they really allow God to show his power over all of these Egyptian gods, right? The Egyptians had deities for just about everything you could think of. It was, and I know it's going to be very hard to read on the screen. I thought it might be a little bit bigger on this screen versus mine, but it's still pretty small. But you see how each one of these lines up to a different deity. Sometimes you had a deity that hits in multiple spots, but in every case, God is basically saying, look, you have a fly god. Okay, well, if you have a fly god, maybe he'll make these flies stop, right? And he sends flies anyway to take over. And then, of course, we finally throughout these plagues, right, we get to this final plague, right, which is the death of the firstborn, which I actually think this chart lines out a really good analysis here, and I'm just going to read it, right? Because this plague was a judgment on all of Egypt's gods, including Pharaoh himself, because Pharaoh was looked at as having deity-like aspects. So in Exodus 1, Pharaoh had killed the sons of Israel. Now the Lord kills the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. Pharaoh will now let Israel go, and then, of course, he's going to later lose his army. So this full judgment is being taken place. And I think it's interesting too, as you see the first few plagues, we see that they are kind of impacting both the Israelites and the Egyptians. But the further we get down the line, right, it starts really hitting Egypt. And while the Israelites experience some of it, obviously, when we get to the final one, the Israelites are left untouched. But why is that? Right? It's something called the Passover, right? Which is something we'll talk a bit more about next week. But basically, all the Israelites have to slaughter an animal, slaughter a lamb, put the blood over the door, right? And God passes over them, and they are safe, and they will continue to institute this and remember it for years and years to come, right? But again, we'll talk more about the Passover as well as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which also was instituted kind of right at the end of the 10 plagues as well. The last big highlight here, and with PowerPoint I always forget I have like a slide to show here. So the last one is the consecration of the firstborn. Right, so this is something that's going to continue on right through the Old Testament. This dedicating of your first fruits to God, right? Which of course then as you look into the New Testament, some of the foreshadowing of we're expected to give our best, right? To give our first fruits to God as well, and so you're going to see this consecration of the firstborn, which is, again, a reminder of the Passover and God bringing them out of Egypt. So it's going to be really interesting as we continue on through the wandering in the wilderness and seeing how often the Israelites want to go back to Egypt, that they have all these ceremonies that are to celebrate and remember that God brought them out of Egypt, but yet they still want to go back. Right? So it's a very interesting juxtaposition of ideas here. All right. So let's look at the map, right? Where we are currently, right? The Israelites live in the land of Goshen, all right? But they're going to exit Egypt, and so after the 10 plagues, they're walking through the wilderness here, and they're going to get to the Red Sea, also called the Sea of Reeds by some. There's like some translation there to in terms of which one is actually correct. I'm going to go with Red Sea because that's what it's called today. When we talk about it. So we're going to get this final round 12 knockout punch, right, for God to the Egyptians, right, which is this salvation by water. Okay, Pharaoh's final fatal mistake, right, after making all of these mistakes that have cost so many lives to his people, is to change his mind once again, right, and basically decides to send his entire army after the Israelites, which results in catastrophic loss, losing his whole army as well as his own life, and God's people are saved. This is, to my knowledge, I could have missed one or two, but to my knowledge at this point, this is the second time in history, right, already that God's chosen people, first, we saw with Noah, right, saved by water when the rest of the earth is destroyed. We now see the Israelites being saved through passing through water, which is kind of loose, foreshadowing possibly to Christ's gospel, right, where we are then saved, which we see in 1 Peter, right, 1 Peter 3, it says, compares it to Noah at least, this saving by water. All right, so at this point, the Israelites are out of Egypt. So I know I've talked a lot these first few minutes. Any thoughts, any questions or comments on just kind of this time in Egypt and this first piece before I head on?
I think it's interesting that not only did they leave, but the Egyptians gave them gold before they left.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's pretty wild.
And the fact that God basically told them, hey, go ask them for this, they're going to give it to you. Yeah, they plundered them, right? Left them in total ruin, for sure.
I like your point that the attention that's given to a role does not always indicate its significance. Like with the midwives or Jochebed, that even though they're not given, like you said, a lot of screen time, their role is still significant.
Mm-hmm. For sure. All right. So next, we're going to move on to Mount Sinai, right? And admittedly, as I said at the beginning of this class, we're not going to be able to hit details of every little story we get to. There's just too much material to cover. But Israel's going to get to Mount Sinai, and things are going to go south pretty quick at Mount Sinai. So we'll check the map again, right? So they've traveled south, and now they've been traveling for about 3 months at this point when they reach Sinai. It says after the third new moon. I'm not sure what phase the moon was in when they left, so I'm just going to assume it's about 4 months. But they've been traveling a little while at this point when they get to Sinai. And the book of Exodus splits pretty evenly between the time they are in Egypt and all the plagues and getting out and crossing the Red Sea, and then this time at Sinai. So at Sinai, they're going to be there for about a year. Okay, so they're gonna be hanging out at Mount Sinai. You're going to get some of the heavy, core instructional doctrine that the Israelites are going to have to adhere to for the rest of their history. Right, one of the big ones that we still reference all the time, right, is the Ten Commandments. Of course, are going to be given at Mount Sinai. But I think often in the children's stories we talk about the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai, but there were like a bunch of other laws that were also given there while Moses is communing with God. We're also going to see at Mount Sinai like a really heavy dose of God's character. We're going to see that also throughout their time in the wilderness as well, and we're going to look at that in detail towards the end of class this morning. And then, of course, when they first get to Sinai, right, they're at Sinai. Moses goes up on the mountain, and the people, they get a bit impatient, right, and it's their first fatal blunder. Mere weeks after having a covenant with God that says, like, you know what, we're not going to complain. We're all in. God's going to fulfill His promise. We're going to worship Him. We're going to do what we're supposed to do. They decide to erect a golden calf. So, and again, we'll get to that. I know it's a little bit of an out of order class this morning, but that's for a reason, and we'll talk about it here in just a few minutes. All right. So, like I said, we're going all the way through Numbers and Deuteronomy this morning as well. So we're gonna do a brief chronology of pretty much every time that we see Israel complain or not trust God during that 40 years from Egypt to the Promised Land, which is a common theme, right? Jordan's talked about the last couple weeks, right? We see frequently in the book of Genesis some big name guys, right? We see Abraham, we see Isaac, we see Jacob, and all three of them at various times have decided to take matters into their own hands. God gives them a promise, God gives them a plan. They still decide to do things their own way. And it rarely, never works for them when they decide to do things their own way instead of God's way. In fact, we see Abraham and Isaac do the exact same play, where they both pretend their wife is their sister with similar results there. But so Israel now is not any different than any of these other leaders. All right, so in Egypt, we often talk about the complaining in the wilderness, but the Israelites were already not really trusting God before they even get out of Egypt, right? When Moses first shows up, right? Moses shows up, talks to Pharaoh. A lot of times we skip over the fact that Moses comes, he talks to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh doesn't just say, like, okay, and we skip to the plagues, right? Pharaoh submits them to more hard labor, right? Takes away their some of their materials to make it harder to make bricks to build, which of course leads the Israelites to their normal complaint, which is, hey, you told me we were supposed to be having this great promise. You told us we were getting out of this, and now it's worse than it was before, right? Which I think is something we can probably relate to. And then, of course, we see before they cross the Red Sea, again, something we don't always focus on in the children's stories. It's just kind of a fun part of studying, I think, the Old Testament as we get all the in-betweens. But the Israelites are in that wilderness, and they see Egypt coming after them, and they say, why would you do this? why'd you bring us out here just to get slaughtered by the Egyptians out here, right? We would have preferred just to keep living in Egypt where we were than to get murdered out here in the desert, which, like, admittedly, like, I'd probably be of the same, like, I don't want to get murdered in a desert either. I don't know if I want to get murdered anywhere, but I would definitely choose the desert as not a great spot for it anyway. But God's response in Egypt to these is deliverance, right? He shows his power. He says, you know what? You're right, I will show my power, and he brings them out of Egypt. Okay, then we're going to be on our way to Mount Sinai, right? Which is only about 3 months, right? It's only about 3 months. First, they complain that the water is bitter. Okay, I don't know how bitter this water is. I'm not sure how valid of a complaint this is, right? But nevertheless, God says, you know what? I will make your water sweeter because you don't want it to be bitter. I will give you, I'll give you sweet water. And of course, you're going to see hunger, right? They're going to be hungry for the first time, and God's going to provide manna and quail. Right? He's going to provide them with manna and quail to eat every day. He's just going to keep providing it, which, you know, honestly, like, this is probably a bad analogy, but like I kind of feel like it's like my cats, right? Like they just show up every day, and I give them food and water. Right? They don't do anything to get the food and water. They just like exist, right? They kind of like keep on doing their thing, and then the food and water shows up due to no work of their own. Right, but God's going to keep on providing this this quail and this water for them, and this manna for them continually. But then they're still in the desert, and they're going to be thirsty again. Right, they're going to be thirsty. So this is where God is actually going to provide water for the first time. Right, he's going to have Moses strike a rock, right, to provide water, which is going to be big later on in the story of Moses. For those of you that are familiar with the story of Moses, it's going to be important later on that here God instructs him to strike a rock. But in all these cases, again, God is providing for them, right? We don't see any real punishments yet from this complaining. We see God hearing the complaint and solving the problem. But now we get to Mount Sinai. Right? This is where everything changes for the Israelites forever, honestly. So Moses is gone just a bit too long, right? Someone can correct me if it actually says explicitly, but I don't believe it says exactly how long Moses is on the mountain. It just says that he's up there, right? He's getting these laws, right? We don't know exactly the time frame. I would assume, some extensive period of time to get all of it written down. But he's gone too long, and Israel decides, like, we want something to worship. We want some physical manifestation of something to worship. They managed to convince Aaron, Moses' brother, to build this golden calf to worship. There's an interesting story on this where God is actually the one that tells Moses what's going on, right? Moses is up there on the mountain. He's like, hey, by the way, down in the camp, things are going bad for you. So then when Moses gets down, he's already trying to figure out, like, okay, what's going on, right? But he starts hearing the camp, kind of in disarray and in excitement when he gets down there and finds the golden calf. But this is the first point where we see God say, like, enough is enough. Right, in the story of the Israelites, we've seen him condemn in the past the entirety of the earth, right, to death. In the story of Noah, we've seen him condemn Sodom and Gomorrah's entire cities to be flattened to rubble and total destruction. This is the first time we see him acting on execution of the Israelites. So the first thing he's going to do is he's going to gather some of the sons of Levi, and he's going to order 3,000 Israelites to be killed in the camp for this sin. But then also, we don't really know a number on this, but he's going to drop a plague on them as well. So he's going to have this 3,000 people killed, symbolically, and then also there's going to be a plague as a result of this sin. So where does Israel, go right from this sin, right? It's going to be a challenge. But they will eventually leave Sinai, right? After about a year, they've gotten the law, they've been hanging out, and God says, despite all of this, despite everything you've done, let's head on, right? I'm still gonna, again, God's always trying to fulfill his plan. He says, I'm still gonna take you to the promised land. Let's pack up. Let's go. Let's go. We're gonna move on. We're gonna get to the promised land. In the wilderness, of course, before they even encounter the promised land, there's a really interesting story where it says that in Numbers 11, it says that the Israelites complained about their misfortunes, right? We don't know what those misfortunes were. We don't know if the misfortunes are just that they're in the desert still and they haven't made it to the promised land. We don't know if they're encountering people. It doesn't really say in great detail what it was. Maybe it's the food. Maybe they don't like the food anymore. I'm not certain. But nevertheless, it says, I think, that the rabble wanted meat, right? I was trying to read about what this rabble was. There was a mixture of people that left with Israel, right? There were some people that had kind of gotten interspersed with them that also left when the Israelites left Egypt. There are some thoughts that maybe they were the ones who kind of initiated this, and you could piece that together if you wanted to, based on maybe they're not as tied to God, right? They're just out here. They're just along for the ride. Which I think, we could say that about, some of us as well. Sometimes we've just been along for the ride and not as connected as we need to be. It makes it easy to complain. But first, what God's going to do is he's going to consume a portion of the camp with fire because of this. I'm not sure, it doesn't say when he consumes a portion of the camp with fire that anybody died. It doesn't specifically say he killed anybody, I don't think, with that. But I would think maybe a few people died, but if nothing else, a lot of damage to the camp just as a show of force. But then God gives them kind of like the Golden Corral treatment, right? They want meat, so he's going to give them more meat than they can possibly consume. He's going to give them meat until they don't want any more. And then after he does all of this, he's still going to institute another plague that's going to kill a number of the Israelites. So it's kind of God. I like to think God. Being in the image of God, right? God has a sense of humor too. Sometimes, like when they start complaining, he's mad about it. He says, "You know what? I'll give you what you want. I'll give you so much of what you want that I'll show you that you were in the wrong anyway." But nevertheless, Israel, we still see God's provision, right? We see death, but then God is still going to provide a redemption plan later, as we'll see. So in Numbers 12, we see that Miriam and Aaron are going to oppose Moses. They're going to complain about his leadership, right? Because of that, Miriam becomes leprous, right? And the rest of the people in this story, right? In Numbers 12, it says the rest of the people also wanted to mutiny and return to Egypt. We have the story of the sons of Korah who end up getting swallowed by the earth. And then in number 16, right, we also see them accusing God and Moses of killing God's people, right? So there's a number of times in the wilderness they're going to do this, but God in each case, right, finds a way to provide for them. The last one they're going to complain about is, we're going to spend a little bit of time on here, is the challenge of the promised land, right? So this is another one of those big Bible stories, right? As kids, only Joshua and Caleb were the ones that had faith. The other 10 of the spies were killed by a plague after they said they did not think they could enter. But again, we have God's twisted kind of form of provision. Anyway, they say, we don't want to enter the promised land. God says, okay, you won't enter the promised land. You got it. You're going to stay in the wilderness, though, for 40 years instead, which is a much worse alternative to the promised land. So in the wilderness, of course, we have God providing water for a second time, which we'll talk to a little bit in the story of Moses, but this is where Moses decides, God says to speak to a rock, and Moses hits the rock, which of course is not what God wanted. But again, we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. And then in each of these cases, God is still, even in the case of, when they're in the wilderness, they complain about God and Moses. God sends a bunch of serpents to strike the people, and he kills a bunch of people, but still allows Moses to make this scepter that when they look at the scepter, they'll be healed. So God, even in his punishment, still provides a way of redemption. All right, so let's talk about Moses as a leader, as a character. So his name, of course, which Jordan's done a good job of the last couple weeks building out, it means to draw out. This name was originally given to him by his Egyptian mother, actually, because she drew him, she pulled him out of the water. But it ends up having a double meaning, right? Because Moses then draws the Israelites out of Egypt through water as well. So the good things of Moses, right? We see throughout his time, he does trust in God. He seems to follow God's plan. He's described as the meekest man on earth in Numbers 12, which I would say is a pretty great assessment of someone. If someone told me that, I'd feel good about myself. He boldly stands in the gap for his people, right? Which is something you want from any leader, right? We see it with Pharaoh, even though it took a little bit of convincing by God to get him there. Pretty much every time Moses stood in front of Pharaoh, he's putting his life on the line, right? Anyone that stood in front of a king for any reason, you said the wrong thing, death was always on the table, and he did that. We also see the same thing in front of God, right? There are multiple occasions where God, both at Mount Sinai in the wilderness, where God says, hey, Moses, I'll make a great nation out of you. I want to wipe these guys out. Let me wipe these guys out. And Moses is the one that steps in and says, no, God, you promised that Israel, the nation of Israel, was going to be the ones that entered the promised land and stood in the gap there. And then we also, from all intents and purposes, we see that he's a hard worker, right? He works so hard leading the people that at one point he asks God basically for death. He's like, look, if you're not going to deliver us, please just kill me. This is just an absolute mess. I'm tired. Please just kill me. Which I think, again, we can all probably relate to that at some point in time. So that's the great thing. So right now, Moses is a great leader, right? But we have some bad, too. We have some bad parts of Moses, right? So we see at first that we see him as a coward on multiple occasions. First, which we'll talk about in the ugly, he murders somebody, and then he runs away, which I think probably a good idea. But nevertheless, he runs away to escape Egypt. When God encounters him at the burning bush, he makes constant excuses, right? Which also goes along with a lot of cowards are also excuse makers, right? He says no, for a million different reasons, I can't be the one to lead Israel out of Egypt. And God continually answers those with, no, I will do this for you. I will do this for you. I will make sure you're set up. And then we also see, he's impatient with God, right? In that moment when he asks for death, he's finally at the point where he's like, look, come on, God, let's get on with it. But again, it's understandable. And lastly, we have, the ugly. He's a hothead and a murderer, right? He sees an Egyptian, treating an Israelite cruelly and decides to murder them. And we see at the rock, right, that he never fully solves this issue when God tells him to speak to the rock, but he doesn't listen. He does what he did before, right? And he strikes the rock instead. But not only that, he puts himself at the same level with God, right? He says, "How long shall we do this for you? Let me provide this for you," right? Us. He puts himself on that same level that he's doing this for the people. And then, of course, this cost him. This mistake cost him the promised land, which we don't really know. It feels like a harsh punishment, right? To me, he makes that mistake, and he's done all this good, and yet he's not allowed the promised land. So I spent some time thinking about it. I don't really know what all led into this. I thought possibly it's just that he put himself on the level of God. Possibly there's this idea that teams are a reflection of their coach, right? We never see Israel pull in the same direction at any point. They're always kind of struggling, right? There's people that are always there, and maybe at some point God's like, look, you've tried hard, so I was going to let you in, but you finally made this mistake and it's too much. I don't know. exactly, and I don't think we'll ever truly know what happened here. But despite all this, right, despite all of the bad and the ugly, God still chooses Moses, right? We saw that last week and the week before as well. God chooses imperfect people, right, to lead throughout the Old Testament. He still chooses imperfect people to lead today, and we can take confidence that even when we have these weaknesses, when we have a moment where we are not living up to what God wants us to, that we can still serve Him. All right, so I'm going to run through these real quick because time is escaping me. So what can we see of ourselves, right? We like to bash on Israel a lot. And in church, we like to say, like, how could they do this? How could they do that? But I think when you actually look at it, you're going to see a lot of things that we can do if we're not careful. So the first one is, impatience and boredom leading to sin. A lot of times, idle hands are the ones that get driven in to sin. They sin simply because, like, in my opinion, Moses was up there too long for their liking, right? If he had just gone up and was back in the afternoon, they probably don't make the mistake. He was gone a little bit longer, though, and they felt like they had to be doing something. So we need to be careful that while waiting on God, that we still act in accordance with His will. They also struggle to leave the quote-unquote good parts of their old life behind. They liked the food they had in Egypt. Even though they struggled there, they still liked the food. They liked that they were safe, I guess, in Egypt. And they wanted to go back numerous occasions. And we can struggle with that too sometimes, wanting to go back to the good parts of our life before we found Christ. They seem to dwell pretty often on the bad things that are happening to them instead of being grateful for the good. Right? We see complaints about the food provided rather than being thankful that food is being provided. Right? We see this constant struggle where they only think they feel like God is punishing them, even when it's just part of the journey. Right? And we also see this transactional relationship, right, where for them, God is just a means to an end. A lot of these people, God just gives them food, God gives them water, God's going to take them to a promised land. There's not always this spirit of worship. It's a come on, God, and I think we can get into that sometimes with our prayers, right? God, please give me this, give me that, give me that. And then if God doesn't deliver those things exactly in the timing that we say, we get frustrated. But I do have some sympathy for Israel here, right? Because we really only get a handful of stories of rebellion throughout 40 years. They probably rebelled more than that, but we only really get a handful of stories. And there are probably many more with similar outcomes. But it's really hard to have no control, right? The hardest thing for me throughout this whole story is when God would, they wouldn't know until that morning if God lifted from the tent whether they were moving or not. I hate moving at all. Like, I would prefer to stay in my same house as long as possible, right? And I can't imagine every single day I unpack my stuff. I try to get settled in. I've got a family, right? These are real people with families. They try to settle in. And the next morning, God says, okay, we're up and going. But the next time, it's like, it could be 3 weeks. It could be 4 days. You never know, right? And that's so relatable, I think, for all of us, just not having this control. And it can lead to impatience. So I think some of these sins are understandable. And I think why I highlighted here at the bottom is like Israel's punished according to their sin. And like we very much are also convicted of that same sin, right? The only reason that we don't get struck down by God, the only reason that we are able to live this life of hope is because of Christ, right? Christ came, He sacrificed, He died so that we don't have to. And God gives us that redemption through that, which is really sobering, I think, as we look at the Old Testament, that we are some of those same people. All right, so we've got 2 minutes here. All right. Hey, time this out great by running through it. All right. So what do we learn of God's character, right, throughout this? Because remember, as we said in the first week, God is the main character of the Old Testament. We have all these stories of earthly leaders, but God is the main character. So we're going to see that He provides when we ask, right? Maybe not in our timing or the exact way that we would like, but God is going to provide for our needs. And God always delivers Israel time and time again. We see God's wrath and his punishment, right? But again, it's always important to remember God's holiness, right? God is set apart. God simply cannot exist in an imperfect, like he cannot interact with imperfect man, which we're going to get into next week a lot with the law, right? So he must punish sin. It is part of his innate character. It's not that he's just some kind of angry guy on a whim who kills. He simply cannot be in the presence of sin. And of course, he redeems, right? We talked about at the beginning of the class these two big themes of redemption and the reign, right? Redemption is that just because God punishes sin does not mean there's no hope, right? There's always, even for Israel, the hope that eventually they will make it to the promised land and God will deliver on that. And that he loves us enough to give us a path out, right? Even out of our punishment, God still gives us a path. And then, of course, I think I didn't put it on the slide here, but this idea of reign is that God's in total control. I mentioned week 1 that you see all these leaders of men, right? And they're always going to try to be in charge. Egypt was one of the most powerful nations, if not the most powerful nation in the world at the time. And God still brought them to ruin because he wanted to. And the only one that reigns is God and us through Christ.